I worked various gigs in my hometown, including night shifts at Willow Grove Rehabilitation Center. The eerie silence of the nights and the unsettling stillness of the halls made my imagination run wild. My supervisor, Janet, assured me that the rumors of hauntings were just stories to scare the newcomers. "Welcome to the night shift," Janet said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll get used to it." I settled into the routine, the quiet hours broken only by the occasional call bell. The patients were mostly elderly, their frail bodies requiring constant care. But there was one patient who stood out, Mr. Turner in room 213. He was a retired professor, sharp-witted but bedridden. "Have you heard any strange noises?" Mr. Turner asked me one night, his eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, trying to reassure him. "It's just the old building settling, nothing to worry about." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The creaks and groans seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, as I made my rounds, I noticed Mr. Turner's door ajar. I peeked inside and saw him staring at the corner of the room, his face pale. "What's wrong, Mr. Turner?" I asked, stepping closer. He pointed a trembling finger towards the shadowy corner. There's something there." I turned, my heart pounding. The corner was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I tried to comfort him, but his fear was contagious. I hurried out of the room, my nerves on edge. The following nights, Mr. Turner's condition worsened. He became agitated, muttering about the shadow that visited him. His pleas for help echoed in my mind, but there was nothing I could do. The other staff dismissed his claims as hallucinations. One particularly stormy night, the power went out, plunging the facility into darkness. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way to Mr. Turner's room. The storm raged outside, and the wind howled like a banshee. I found him cowering under his blanket, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. I scanned the room with my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. As I turned towards the corner, I saw it. A shadowy figure, darker than the night, standing motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart raced. Suddenly, the figure moved, gliding towards me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The room was plunged into darkness again. I fumbled for the light, my hands shaking, but by the time I regained my composure, the shadow was gone. Mr. Turner passed away that night, his face twisted in a final expression of terror. I left Willow Grove soon after, unable to shake the feeling that something sinister lurked in the shadows of room 213. To this day, I can still feel its cold, unblinking stare. I tried to put the experience behind me, but the memory of that shadow haunted me. I couldn't forget the terror in Mr. Turner's eyes, or the chilling presence I felt in his room. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me home from Willow Grove. Late one night, I woke to a strange sound, a soft whispering that seemed to come from the corners of my bedroom. I sat up, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down my spine. "He's here. He's here." I turned on the light, my heart pounding. The room was empty, but the oppressive feeling was all too familiar. I knew that the shadow from room 213 had found me. Over the next few days, the whispers continued. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that disappeared when I turned to look. Sleep became impossible as the sense of dread grew stronger. I felt like I was being watched, constantly on edge. One evening, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I sat in the middle of my room, the lights off, and waited. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with each passing minute. "Show yourself," I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly, a shadowy figure materialized in front of me. It was the same dark shape I had seen in Mr. Turner's room, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a guttural rasp. "You belong to us now." I felt a crushing weight on my chest. the air growing colder and harder to breathe. The shadow moved closer, its presence suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. In that moment, I understood what Mr. Turner had felt. The overwhelming fear, the sense of being trapped. I knew that I had to find a way to break free, or I would suffer the same fate. Desperate, I reached for the cross that hung around my neck, clutching it tightly. I began to pray, my voice barely a whisper. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as if it were being torn apart. With each word of my prayer, the oppressive feeling lessened. The shadow let out a terrible screech and dissolved into the darkness. The room grew warmer, the air easier to breathe. I knew that the battle was not over. The shadow might have been driven away, but it would return. I had to find a way to protect myself and rid my life of this malevolent presence once and for all. I sought help from a priest, who blessed my home and gave me a small vial of holy water. He warned me that the shadow was a powerful entity, one that thrived on fear and despair. "You must remain strong," he said. "Do not let it consume you." With the priest's guidance, I performed a cleansing ritual in my home, sprinkling holy water in every corner and reciting prayers of protection. The oppressive feeling gradually lifted, and the whispers ceased. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. Cedar Ridge Retirement Home was an imposing building with a long, sordid history. Originally an orphanage in the early 1900s, it had seen countless children pass through its doors, many of whom never found their forever homes. The stories of its haunted past were well known, but I never gave them much thought until I started working the night shift. My first night was uneventful. The elderly residents were mostly asleep, and the halls were eerily silent. My supervisor, Mary, was kind and tried to ease my nerves. "Don't let the stories get to you," she said. "It's just an old building with creaky floors." I nodded, but the unsettling feeling in my stomach persisted. As the weeks passed, I started to hear whispers in the empty hallways, faint and indistinct. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a soft humming. It was a haunting melody, sad and beautiful. I followed the sound to room 305, where Mrs. Avery, a sweet but frail woman, resided. Her door was slightly ajar, and the humming seemed to be coming from inside. "Mrs. Avery?" I called softly, pushing the door open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I shivered and quickly left the room, my mind racing with questions. The next morning, I asked Mary about Mrs. Avery. She looked at me, puzzled. "Mrs. Avery passed away 2 weeks ago," she said. I felt a chill run down my spine. The humming, the whispers, it all started to make sense. Cedar Ridge was more than just an old building. It was a place where the past lingered, where the echoes of its former inhabitants remained. The following nights were a blur of sleeplessness and fear. The whispers grew louder, the humming more frequent. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to focus on them. One night, I saw her, a little girl in a tattered dress, standing at the end of the hallway. She was pale, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She stared at me, unblinking, before turning and disappearing into room 305. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to run, but I forced myself to follow. The room was cold, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The little girl stood by the window, her back to me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. "Help us," she said, her voice a mournful wail. "We're trapped." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The room began to spin, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. I fled the room, the little girl's cries echoing in my ears. I left Cedar Ridge the next day, unable to face the horrors that haunted its halls. The retirement home has since been abandoned, its dark past left to rot along with the building. But the whispers, the humming, and the little girl's plea for help still haunt my dreams. The echoes of Cedar Ridge continued to torment me even after I left. I tried to move on with my life, but the memories of that place were like a dark shadow that followed me everywhere. I couldn't escape the feeling that the spirits of Cedar Ridge were reaching out, trying to pull me back. Late one night, I woke to the sound of soft crying. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The crying seemed to come from the hallway outside my bedroom. I got up, my hands trembling, and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the crying continued, growing louder and more desperate. I followed the sound, my mind racing with fear. It led me to the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was cold, the air heavy with a sense of dread. In the middle of the room stood the little girl from Cedar Ridge, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out to me, her voice a desperate plea. "Help us," she whispered. "We're still trapped." I backed away, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The little girl dissolved into shadows, and the room grew unbearably cold. I fled back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. The crying stopped, but the oppressive feeling remained. The next day, I contacted a paranormal investigator, desperate for answers. He agreed to visit my home and conduct an investigation. When he arrived, he immediately sensed the dark presence that lingered in the air. "This place is haunted," he said, his voice grave. "The spirits from Cedar Ridge have attached themselves to you. They are seeking help to find peace." The investigator performed a cleansing ritual, using sage and holy water to purify my home. He instructed me to confront the spirits, to acknowledge their pain, and help them move on. That night, I prepared myself for what was to come. I sat in the spare bedroom, the lights off, and waited. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The little girl appeared once more, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help us," she whispered. "I will help you," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "Tell me what you need." The little girl nodded, her form flickering. "We need to be remembered. We need to be set free from the darkness." I spent the next few weeks researching the history of Cedar Ridge, uncovering stories of the children who had lived and died there. I wrote down their names, their stories, and held a memorial service in their honor. I prayed for their souls, asking for their release from the torment that bound them to this world. Gradually, the oppressive feeling in my home lifted. The whispers ceased, the shadows faded, and the little girl's presence disappeared. Hollow Creek Sanatorium was an infamous institution with a reputation for horrors beyond imagination. Built in the early 1900s, it had seen countless tormented souls pass through its doors, many of whom met gruesome fates. The townspeople whispered about the experiments, the screams, and the malevolent spirits that lingered long after the doors were shut. Desperate for work, I dismissed the tales and took the night shift job at the now converted long-term care facility. The first few weeks were deceptively calm. The residents, mostly elderly, were quiet, lost in the fog of their memories. But one patient stood out. Mr. Harris, a retired historian with sharp eyes that belied his frail frame. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked me one night as I checked his vitals. I forced a smile, hiding my discomfort. "I've heard the stories, but I haven't seen anything." He leaned closer, his eyes piercing mine. "You will." His words clung to me like a dark omen. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. I heard footsteps echoing in the empty hallways, whispers that seemed to slither through the walls, and the temperature would plummet without warning, leaving me shivering and filled with dread. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a soft tapping coming from room 217. Mrs. Langley, a reclusive woman, resided there. I knocked softly and pushed the door open. "Mrs. Langley?" I called out, but there was no response. The room was empty, the bed neatly made. I was about to leave when I saw it. A dark figure standing in the corner, its form barely discernible in the dim light. My heart raced as I stared at it, paralyzed with fear. The figure seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its presence suffocating. Suddenly, it moved, gliding towards me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stopped just inches from me, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. "Leave this place," it whispered, its voice a guttural rasp. I fled the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure's warning echoed in my mind, but I couldn't leave. I needed the job, and I couldn't let my fear control me. The next night, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered violently, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to focus on them. I confided in Mr. Harris, hoping for some reassurance. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to span lifetimes. "Hollow Creek was a place of unimaginable suffering," he said. "The spirits of those who died here are trapped, their pain and rage binding them to this world." A chill ran down my spine. The stories were true. The sanatorium was haunted by the tortured souls of its past. One particularly stormy night, the power went out, plunging the facility into darkness. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way through the halls, my nerves on edge. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all directions, each filled with pain and malevolence. I reached Mr. Harris's room and found him sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The children," he said. "They never left." As if on cue, the air grew colder, and the sound of giggling echoed down the hallway. It was a chilling, otherworldly sound that sent shivers down my spine. I turned to see shadowy figures moving towards us, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Their eyes were hollow voids, their smiles twisted with anguish and malice. "We have to go," Mr. Harris said urgently. "Now." I helped him out of bed, and we made our way down the hall. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more menacing. We reached the main hallway, but the front doors were locked, the keys nowhere to be found. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel the walls closing in, as if the building itself were alive and hungry. "There's another way," Mr. Harris said, leading me towards the basement stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of horrors. The air was colder than death, the darkness impenetrable. The walls were lined with old, rusted medical equipment, and the floor was sticky with something that I prayed was just water. We navigated through the maze of old equipment and storage rooms, the shadows always close behind. I could hear the children's voices, a mix of laughter and cries for help, their forms becoming more grotesque with each step. We reached a heavy door at the far end of the basement. Mr. Harris struggled with the lock, his hands shaking. The shadows closed in, their forms becoming more solid, more real. Their faces were twisted masks of agony and rage, their hands reaching out to drag us into their eternal torment. "Please, hurry," I pleaded, glancing over my shoulder. The door finally opened, and we stumbled into a small, dimly lit room. In the center stood an old wooden table, covered in strange symbols and artifacts. The walls were lined with jars filled with grotesque specimens, eyes that seemed to follow our every move. Mr. Harris quickly closed the door behind us, the shadows pounding against it from the other side. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's a sanctuary," Mr. Harris replied. "A place where the spirits can't reach us." We sat down at the table, and Mr. Harris began to explain. Hollow Creek had been a place of torment for many, especially the children. The staff had performed unspeakable experiments on them, and their spirits remained trapped, unable to move on. "We have to perform a ritual to free them," Mr. Harris said, handing me a small ornate dagger. "It's the only way." I hesitated, but the pounding on the door grew louder, more desperate. I took the dagger and followed Mr. Harris's instructions, carving symbols into the table and reciting the ancient incantations. Each word felt like a weight lifting from my soul, but the air grew thicker, the stench of decay overwhelming. As we completed the ritual, the pounding stopped, and an eerie silence filled the room. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling began to lift, but the silence was shattered by a piercing scream, a cry of pure agony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It's done," Mr. Harris said, his voice filled with relief. "They are free." We cautiously opened the door and made our way back upstairs. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced. Hollow Creek felt different, lighter. The spirits had been set free, but the building seemed to weep, its walls stained with the blood and tears of those who had suffered within. I left Hollow Creek the next day, unable to shake the memories of what had happened. The facility has since been abandoned, a dark chapter in the town's history. But the echoes of that night still haunt my dreams, a reminder of the unseen horrors that can linger just beyond the edge of reality. Years have passed, and I still carry the scars of that night. The memory of the children's voices, the shadowy figures, and the malevolent presence that had haunted Hollow Creek remain etched in my mind. I have never returned to Hollow Creek, nor have I ever worked a night shift again. The darkness that lurked within those walls was more than just a haunting. It was a reminder of the evil that humans are capable of inflicting upon the innocent. To this day, I can still hear the faint whispers and the chilling giggles of the children when the night is at its darkest. Hollow Creek may be abandoned, but its legacy of suffering and torment lives on, a haunting reminder of the past. The spirits may have been freed, but the darkness remains, a shadow that will never fully disappear. The horrors of Hollow Creek have left an indelible mark on my soul. I can no longer find solace in the quiet of the night. Instead, I am plagued by nightmares of the children, their hollow eyes and twisted smiles. I see their faces in every shadow, hear their whispers in every gust of wind. The darkness has become a part of me, a constant reminder of the evil that lurks just beneath the surface of our reality. Every now and then, I drive by the abandoned building, its windows boarded up, its once grand facade now crumbling. I can feel the malevolent energy still emanating from within, a silent cry for help that goes unanswered. I know that the spirits of Hollow Creek are at peace, but the echoes of their torment will never truly fade. I have tried to move on with my life, but the darkness of Hollow Creek follows me wherever I go. I see the shadows in my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I turn to look. I hear the whispers in the dead of night, a constant reminder of the suffering that took place within those walls. I am haunted by the knowledge that true evil exists, and that it can take root in even the most innocent of places. I'm a longtime Colorado resident, and about 15 years ago, I moved to a small town called Junction. It was a quaint, almost sleepy town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. I fell in love with its charm and decided to call it my forever home. But there are things about Junction that even the locals don't talk about, things that haunt the dark corners of the town and lurk in the shadows of our memories. It all started one cold winter night when I was working late at a local mom-and-pop shop. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and the town seemed to be holding its breath in the icy grip of the night. I was about to close up when I received a phone call. The voice on the other end was trembling and filled with fear. "It's Warren," the voice said. "Warren Barnes. He's missing." Warren Barnes was a homeless man, but he was more than that to the people of Junction. He was a fixture in our community, a kind soul who always had a smile and a story to share. He had his routine, coffee at the local diner, a visit to the library, and then settling into his favorite alley behind the bridal shop with his precious paperbacks. Everyone knew Warren, and everyone cared for him in their own way. When Warren didn't show up that day, the shopkeepers knew something was wrong. A search party was quickly organized, and the police were notified. The entire town was on edge, but no one expected the horror that was about to unfold. The first sign of trouble was a bloodied jacket found near the boat ramp by the river. It was Warren's jacket. Then, pieces of his body started washing up along the riverbank, an arm here, a leg there. It was clear that Warren had met a gruesome fate, and the peaceful town of Grand Junction was thrown into chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was a drifter, others whispered about a dark presence in the town, but no one could have imagined the truth. The police investigation led them to the Cohey house on the edge of town. The Coheys were a quiet family, their son Brian an awkward introverted teenager. But behind closed doors, Brian was hiding a darkness that no one could have foreseen. Brian was a smart kid, perhaps too smart for his own good. He had a fascination with the macabre, an obsession with death that went beyond the usual teenage curiosity. He would often talk about how to dismember a body, or the best ways to make someone disappear. His parents thought it was just a phase, a morbid sense of humor. They were wrong. Brian had been planning Warren's murder for months. He had meticulously studied his routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That cold winter night, he followed Warren to his sleeping spot under the bridge. Warren never stood a chance. Brian attacked Warren with a kitchen knife, stabbing him repeatedly until his pleas for mercy were silenced. Then, with a chilling precision, he dismembered Warren's body, placing the pieces in garbage bags and dumping them in the river. He kept Warren's head and hands as macabre trophies, hiding them in a plastic container in his bedroom closet. The police found Brian's car near the boat ramp, bloodstains still visible in the trunk. When they confronted Brian, he confessed without emotion, detailing every horrific step of his plan. His parents were devastated, unable to comprehend the monster their son had become. Brian was arrested, and the town of Grand Junction was left to pick up the pieces. The horror of Warren's murder cast a long shadow over the community, and the whispers of that dark winter night still linger in the air. But the story doesn't end there. The darkness that consumed Brian Cohey didn't die with his arrest. It seeped into the fabric of the town, a lingering curse that still haunts the streets of Grand Junction. Some nights, when the wind howls through the empty alleys, you can still hear Warren's voice, a ghostly whisper carried on the cold night air. People say that the town has never been the same since that winter. The quaint charm of Grand Junction now hides a sinister undercurrent, a reminder that true horror can lurk in the most unexpected places. The shadows seem darker, the nights colder, and the silence more oppressive. And then there's the Cohey house. It's been abandoned for years, but no one dares to go near it. The locals believe it's cursed, that the evil that Brian unleashed still lingers there. Some say they've seen shadows moving in the windows at night. Others have heard faint whispers and cries for help. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I drove to the edge of town and parked outside the Cohey house. The air was thick with tension, and an unnatural chill seeped into my bones. I stood there, staring at the darkened windows, and for a moment I thought I saw a face staring back at me.